Number 5.
I live in a small town built in bushland where a lot of elderly people reside. So it's safe to say that it's always been a safe neighborhood, and I've never needed to be overly cautious. This is probably why I had often been naive enough to believe that although there is a small possibility of something bad happening to me, I thought it was far too unlikely. At the time, I was 15 years old, and I used to go out on weekends to visit my boyfriend at the time, who lived quite a while away from me. I wasn't able to drive at this age, so public transport was my only means of going over to visit him. This meant walking about 20 minutes from my house to a bus stop, catching the bus into the city, and then catching a train to his house. I used to do the same trip every week, and I felt safe taking the trip by myself. As I was only able to see him once during the week, I would leave early in the morning and get there and stay until fairly late before going home. Because it was late by the time I left my boyfriend's house, and public transport was less frequent at that hour, it would be a waste of time for my boyfriend to travel any of the way back home with me. So every week, I made the trip back home alone. On one particular night, after visiting my boyfriend, it was a usual ride on the train back into the city, and I was waiting at the bus station. The bus station is a large, open building above a number of platforms on a lower story where the buses would pull in. I was waiting on the upper story on a bench in front of the stairs that led to the platform I needed for my bus home. I don't recall there being many people around, maybe 1 or 2 people passing by, but it was essentially deserted because of the late hour. Also, on a side note, because I was visiting my boyfriend, I dressed up to look pretty for him. I was wearing a decent casual dress. I had straightened my long hair so it looked neat, and I had just recently received some high platform boots for my birthday, which I thought looked super cool, and they were fun to wear because I didn't feel so short. I was ruffling through my bag for some gum, and I noticed someone sit down on the bench next to me. Usually, when someone sits on a bench which is already occupied, they leave a sort of one-person gap between. But this person sat down right beside me, despite there being a whole bench available. When I looked up from my bag, I saw a man who was maybe 30 years old. I'm a terrible judge of age, so I'm not really sure. I don't remember too much about his appearance. I think he was bald or had short hair. Being naive, I didn't think to try to remember any details about his appearance, which I would have done had this happened to me now. When our eyes met, he asked me something along the lines of, "Have you got any weed?" At 15, I was a good kid and didn't have anything to do with smoking or alcohol, and certainly not hard drugs. I told him no and continued to sit uncomfortable on the bench waiting for the bus. Then he gestured up towards the bus schedule above the stairs to the platform and asked me,
"Where are you heading?"
As if him asking me about the drugs wasn't warning sign enough for me to not tell him where I was going. I obediently told him that I was catching the 123 bus to XYZ. Coincidentally, he responded with,
"Oh, me too."
I found this a bit unlikely since it was a small town where the bus was headed, but it was still possible that he was actually headed this way. I started to get suspicious at this point, and I was already feeling very uncomfortable. I looked down at my phone in hopes that he wouldn't talk to me anymore. He noticed this and asked me what phone service I was with. I told him the service, and he said,
"I've got a voucher for phone credit for that service, but I can't use it because I'm with a different service. Did you want it?"
I politely declined, assuming he had ill intentions, but unsure what benefit he would gain from giving me this voucher. In hindsight, maybe he was trying to get my phone number or something. I honestly don't know. He persisted.
"Are you sure? Why not? I can't use it."
But I declined again. No thank you. Things got weirder after that, when he pointed out my big platform shoes and asked,
"Is it difficult to run in those shoes?"
Creepy. I lied and said, "No, I can run very well in these." He then gestured to the stairs down to the bus platform and suggested that we both go down there to wait for the bus. The platform is very poorly lit, and there was probably no one down there. I did not want to be there alone with this person, so I told him that I was going to wait here, but that he could wait down there if he wanted to. As expected though, he didn't move and remained on the bench with me. A few moments later, I noticed someone walking towards us through the bus station. Against all possible odds, it happened to be someone that I recognized. It was my friend's older brother. He was probably about 17 at the time. "Ben!" I almost shouted when I saw him. He made his way over and stood in front of me on the bench. I asked him which bus he was catching, and luckily it was the same one as me. I was so relieved. We exchanged a few words back and forth, and eventually the creepy guy sitting next to me got up and wandered off. He hadn't said anything while Ben and I were talking. Ben and I went down to the platform and got on the bus when it arrived. And surprisingly, the creepy guy didn't get on the bus like he said he was going to. I told Ben about what had happened and how he had saved me. I can't imagine what would have unfolded if Ben had not showed up when he did. I would have gone down to the platform when the bus arrived, and hopefully he would have not done anything since there was someone driving the bus. If he had gotten as far as getting on the bus with me, I was worried about the 20-minute walk from my bus stop to my house. We are on a dark street surrounded by bush on one side, and I didn't have credit on my phone to call my mum and ask for a lift.
Number 4.
I used to live in a market town in the United Kingdom, and like every town, we had our town mascot. You know that one person everybody knows about? That crazy lady that does loads of meth, or the creepy drunk that shouts at strangers? Yes, that type of mascot. The guy everyone knew in my place was called Johan, sometimes referred to as Johan the Guitar Man by the locals. He was an average-sized guy with a dark beard and a happy demeanor, and he was very religious, a born-again Christian. He would often be found on the street corners talking in tongues while strumming his guitar. He could also be spotted singing one of his songs while giving his posters, every word of which was in rainbow font, to passerby or waving at school children. That, and he'd have maracas he would shake at random intervals. I guess you could say he was some sort of pseudo-street preacher or something. To most, he was harmless, though there were a lot of stories floating around about Johan, and at school there would be frequent stranger danger warnings about him. One such story was that he was in a car crash and had severe brain damage. Another was that he was initially going to study science at the University of Cambridge, but had a religious experience and gave it all up. But by far, the worst rumor we heard was that he'd raped some young girl, but was so overwhelmed with guilt by the act that he lost his mind and decided to convert. There were also weird things that Johan actually did do. It was his birthday sometime in July, and he was giving out invitations in the street to a party he was going to have. I'm afraid I didn't go myself, though I'm curious if people actually did. His apartment, a place above a shop adorned with the words "Jesus loves you" painted across the outside wall, it was tiny, and he invited a lot of people. The overall local attitude towards Johan was that even though he was nuts, he was more or less harmless. Over the years, I collected numerous amounts of his posters, and he'd pop in occasionally to where I worked and we'd chat. I even got one of his CDs off of him. I probably still have it somewhere. Even teachers I knew would put up his posters in their classrooms. I vividly remember my English teacher displaying rainbow-coloured size 36 words stating, "You are all wonderfully loved," obviously gifted from Johan. Anyway, back to me. I had many experiences with Johan over the years, and most of them were pleasant, generally just saying "Hi Johan" as I passed on my way to work and school and whatnot. To be honest, I did get funny vibes off of him, but I decided to ignore them. He actually lived on the same street as me, so we were neighbours and I was eventually used to his constant appearances. One particular day, however, he greeted me by my name. I had never told him my name though.
"Good morning, my dear sister Emma."
I wasn't all surprised by this. He knew the names of a few of my friends, so perhaps they told him my name at some point. I greeted him in return and told him I was doing fine. I didn't want to talk for too long as I had to get to my friend's house, so I tried to keep it short. We talked about something menial, probably the weather. I made my excuse to leave and he ended the conversation with,
"May Jesus shower his ever-flowing love on you. Would you like me to bless you today, Sister Emma?"
I thought this was sweet, so I hesitantly agreed. And hey, it would be a funny story to tell my friend, right? Plus, this probably wouldn't take too long anyway. Johan proceeded to put down his guitar and then roughly grabbed me by my hand, chanting hoarsely in tongues. It hurt. He had scraped my wrist in the process, and it was then I noticed he had grossly long nails. It would be an understatement to say I was a little freaked. The chanting got more intense, and then he suddenly reverted to English.
"May the love of heaven flow over Emma, her descendants, and all those that care for her. May she find a loving husband to provide for her. May her demons be driven from her soul. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. Bless her. Bless her. Bless her."
During all the Jesus loves you and bless her parts, he was leaping up and down enthusiastically while holding my hand tightly, scratching me further. He was excited, laughing manically. He then ended the blessing, if you could call it that, with some vicious, high-pitched mouth trumpeting, like he was impersonating a kazoo or something. If it wasn't totally terrifying, I would have laughed. He eventually let go of my hand. I shakily thanked him and walked away as quickly as possible. Of course, after all of that, I made my way to my friend's place and we laughed about it. Although I showed her my hand or wrist and she was just as freaked out as I was. But I didn't rule it as intentional harm and we both forgot about it and did whatever we were going to do that day. Eventually, I left town and went to university, forgetting all about Johan. But then, through a pal on Facebook, a link to the local news was posted. Johan had been arrested and was to face trials for stalking and sending threatening messages to a girl around my age. It appeared that he was angry at the girl for not responding to his advances after he wanted to be more than just friends with her. And the messages became creepily sexual, asking the girl if she wanted a taste of his chocolate cake. He believed that the girl was his wife and believed that their love was a sign from God, and they were apparently destined to be together. He eventually ended up threatening to kill the girl, her boyfriend, and their families for crimes of adultery. It turns out he was friends with a lot of local gang members, and he was considering sending them to the home of the girl and her boyfriend. The chilling words on one of his final letters to her said,
"God unfortunately says that unless you give up your ways, he will have to execute you. You've seen all the thunder and lightning. Take that as a sign. It would take just one lightning bolt to finish you off, my lovely."
What makes it even worse is that the girl used to go to my school, and although it wasn't at the same time as me, I used to work at the same place as her. In that regard, I questioned the motive behind all of the friendly chats Johan would have with me, and whether he did mean harm behind all the oddly rough hand grabbing. For the most part though, I believe that he was a man that needed help, but he was largely ignored due to being harmless. It's a shame myself and my old hometown, including that poor girl, had to find out the hard way. He eventually got detained under the Mental Health Act, and I have to say that I'm relieved for him.
Number 3.
I'll try to keep this as brief and detailed as possible. However, my story becomes quite hard to explain without giving any context. I'm a 17-year-old boy now and have been interested in mountaineering and the wilderness ever since I was a young lad. This story takes place in the summer of 2011 when I was about 11 years old. My family and I, being the adventurous type, decided to climb Mount Rinjani in Indonesia, a huge volcano which is rich in wildlife and forestry. It wasn't strange for my family to go off on these amazing adventures, as we were the types who loved exploring. My family consisted of, all told, about 25 people. The beginning of this encounter starts on the third and final day of our descent down the volcano. After about 7 hours of walking, my uncle, 2 of my cousins, and I had finally got to the bottom. I should have mentioned this earlier, but when we hiked, we all went off in our little pods. My uncle and 2 cousins and I at the front, my 2 sisters, aunt, male cousin, and mother, second, etc. These pods were set about 500 meters apart, and although this is a significant distance, we were 100% certain that no one was between our walking pods, as we all set off at the same time and there is only one way down the summit. But this is where it gets creepy. We were waiting at the bottom for the second pod of family to arrive when, after about 10 minutes of waiting patiently, we heard a loud screaming coming from the direction of the path. We then see my cousin, Seb, and my sister Sarah come sprinting down the volcano, fear in their eyes and a shortness of breath to their speech. The following is their recollection of the events that took place, so forgive me if I'm being a little inaccurate. They were walking on the path which was eerily surrounded with tree lines on both sides, when all of a sudden they all simultaneously notice a black bin bag directly hanging in the way of the path, disrupting the walking pattern of the group. Growing up in Myanmar and knowing just about everything there is to know about spirituality, my mother and aunt described it as a bag one might fill with chicken heads when performing witchcraft. This was mainly because of the placement of it, as if to entice a weary traveller to touch it and thus allow the hex to attach itself. They shrugged it off as a bag filled with fecal matter or something of the sort and continued the descent. A few hundred meters on, and my sister Anne says to my mum and aunt, "Can you feel that?" Though no other words were exchanged, they both knew what my sister meant. They later described it as an urging worry that someone or something was watching them. The next thing to take place is still hard for my family to talk about. They said that Seb whispered to them, "Guys, be very quiet and turn around." My sister and mum complied, though my aunt refusing, stating that she feared the worst. What they saw next can only be described as something from mythology. They recalled seeing a pitch-black dog-shaped creature emerge from the bushes a good 20 meters behind them. They described it as being huge, not in height, but in muscle tone, far too big to be a village dog. They said it was jet black with visibly white teeth, but this is the part that still scares me to this day. They said that, despite the distance separating them, it could be seen as having bright yellow eyes. Now, we are the proud owners of a Newfoundland who weighs in at a solid 90 kilos, and for those who haven't seen them before, at times they can be extremely intimidating, so when my mum says that this thing is huge, I take it at face value. They continued to walk with this thing hunting them, to use their phrase, for a good 5 minutes before it seemingly vanished into the shrubs. They took this as their key to sprint for the bottom, which was now in sight. What worried them most, however, wasn't its appearance, but rather what its intentions were, and how long it may have been on the trail for. The final pod of 6 or so made it down the volcano only 5 minutes after the second arrived, stating that they encountered no such creature, and, what is probably more disturbing, no black bin bag. The reason that I find this so mind-boggling is because the first pod, which I was in, saw no black thing, nor any sign of the bin bag in question. Though this might seem meaningless, us being the first ones down the only route to the bottom knew for a fact that no other mountaineers came after us. So for us not to have seen it, it means that it must have been placed after us, and in addition to this, for the final pod not to have seen it, required someone to remove it once pod 2 went past. This means that there was some weirdo up there tying bin bags to vines, and then untying them once again just to fuck with us. There is also no way it could have blown down, as the volcano was practically windless. This brings me to the final question. What was that black dog creature on the mountain? Was it connected to the voodoo bag which was seen on the path? And finally, has anyone else had such an experience with these beasts? For the record, after arriving home, I checked to see if there was any logical explanation for what they saw. There are no recorded wild dogs which inhabit this part of Indonesia. They maintain their story to this day, and even though I'm usually a skeptic, I have no choice but to believe them. I spoke to my cousin Seb about it a couple of weeks ago, and he's a pretty big guy, like 6'2" rugby player, but he said this thing drove fear straight into his heart. He felt like it was pure evil. He felt as though they were being hunted. What chilled me to the bone was when he told me he distinctly remembers whistling before encountering this creature, and what's even worse, it didn't have a tail. I've been told that these are signs of skinwalkers. Unfortunately, 2 months later, a close family friend who came on the trek was diagnosed with brain cancer. He died last week. My family and I can't help but wonder if that black dog played a part. I know I sound crazy, but with all these things happening and with everything seeming so connected, I don't know what to think anymore.
Number 2.
I graduated high school almost a year ago. I really had no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before them. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called wwoof.com, Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic was aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, was self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I had been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening going on about how he was going to really get involved with farming and throw himself into Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences punctuated with and, or and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of the friends I left back home. We became friends fast, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when we spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and, of course, drugs. Every now and then, he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me that he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me that he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure a week more. A couple of days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Wacko David Koresh and the botched siege by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged.
The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up.
I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopath cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject I just explained to him, and now he's telling me I'm wrong and that Koresh was a martyr? This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After an hour of his absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking loon, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy and much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket, praying I grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it, and I turned around so he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what had happened and that we needed to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm anyway. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine that he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscience, but late one night I got a text.
Hey, this is Michael. We can get out our car for $280. Want to go traveling?
I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked it up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud banging coming from a barn. I remember thinking that it must have been an animal, but also thinking it must have been a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was just getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walked around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know, it's gross, but I'm the only one who used that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door, and I nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in a corner of my kitchen, facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would only hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo or something. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when I arrived. My guess is that he ran into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained Michael and I's history and what happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon since I believe many of the old hippies thought that they were still avoiding the draft. Honestly though, I didn't mind leaving. I couldn't sleep, knowing Michael might be out there in the woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up.
Number 1.
This happened over a week ago, and I felt like the first bigger shock and paranoia has settled a little, so I wanted to share what happened with me. I will begin my story with a little explanation about how my apartment building is designed, as that information is quite essential to understanding the story. If it matters as well, I'm a female and 21. So I live in a medium-sized town nearby the center area, but still in a somewhat quiet neighborhood. My building basically has elderly people and families living here, so hence the main doors are always locked, so you either need to have a key or have someone buzz you in order to get inside the building. Once you enter the building, there's obviously the staircase. Well, at each mid-floor there are these small balconies. I live on the 3rd floor and you can see directly into my bedroom from the balcony, which is located on the 2nd floor. I want to explain one more thing though before beginning with the juicy stuff. My building is also located behind a big school building, so I usually don't close my curtains as there's nothing but a big empty parking lot in front of it. Now, let's get to the actual experience. It was the night between Wednesday and Thursday, and I didn't have work the next day, so I was just spending some time watching YouTube from my tablet. I hear some noises coming from the hallway. Kind of heavy steps and the sound of someone occasionally bumping into the handrail as if drunk or just tired. But that wasn't really anything out of the ordinary, as I do live in a building with other people, so you do hear noises even at nighttime. The part where it gets weird though is when I heard the footsteps end on my floor. My bedroom wall and the side of my bed where my head is located against a wall where the staircase is on the other side of it, so it was clear that the person had stopped. I don't hear any doors opening, nor any footsteps anymore, just silence. I found it kind of disturbing that someone was just standing in the hallway in the middle of the night. After a while of silence, I heard the footsteps again, but this time much more quiet and gentle, starting to walk back down the stairs. I just thought maybe someone was drunk and entered the wrong staircase or something. Not a big deal, they're gone now. I continued my YouTube marathon for a while before getting kind of sleepy. One thing I really enjoy before going to bed is looking out my window. There's one main road located at the end of the big parking lot, so sometimes I just watch cars passing by before going to sleep. So I put on my music with some quiet volume and began my staring session. During the second song, I suddenly noticed a small source of light and some movement in the down left corner of my eyes. I lowered my gaze and just froze. There was a man on the small balcony staring at me for who knows how long in my bedroom, and I was in just my t-shirt and underwear. After what felt like at least a few minutes of being frozen in shock, I quickly closed the blinds and went to check that both of my apartment doors were properly closed and locked. Luckily, they were. After a while of shivering in my bed, I came to the realization that the man staring at me was most likely the source of the footsteps. he perhaps had heard the sound of someone being awake in my apartment and listened to that for a while. Then maybe noticed the balcony and decided to check it out and noticed that you can see into the windows from there. I'm not completely sure, but I think he could have possibly seen me before I even went to look outside from the window, as I had a small light on in my room and it was relatively dark outside and I had no curtains on. If he didn't see me before though, he for sure as hell did while I was staring out the window. At that point, feeling the discomfort of being creeped on without knowing, my thought process was stopped by the sound of someone trying to open my door. Luckily my door is quite secure, so I didn't think this person could get it open. But then I heard the small letterbox being opened as slowly and quietly as possible. I still feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up while trying to explain this. I have 2 doors, thank God, so he couldn't see directly into my apartment, but I could hear him. He was breathing sort of heavy, constantly swallowing as if he was either very nervous or just somehow disturbed. I think I held my breath and changed into a motionless wax figure until he closed the letterbox and, for some reason, sprinted down the stairs, making a lot of noise again this time. I was so fixated on each sound, so I heard the sound of the hallway door being opened and I assumed that he ran out. I didn't dare look out the window to check as I was still feeling watched. Nothing more happened that night, but I was certainly not getting any sleep after that. I called up my mum and explained what happened. She had work the next day, so I didn't want to disturb her sleep more by asking her to come sleep here or pick me up. So we just agreed that we'd keep the phone line open through Viber throughout the night. I also drank 2 energy drinks. Not such a great idea when your pulse rate is already sky high. I stayed up until it was light outside and normal people were awake. I eventually fell asleep unwillingly. I didn't see the man anymore, at least up until this very moment as I'm sharing this, and I hope to never see him again. But what did happen and has made me even more paranoid is this. The next time I had work after the incident was on a Monday morning. I hadn't really been sleeping well lately and had an early morning. I was already somewhat all over the place, but this just scarred me for life. As I explained before, I have 2 doors in my apartment. Well, I was leaving for work and opened the inner one, and to my surprise, I saw the outer door slightly cracked open. I felt like throwing up and just running into my mum's arms like a little girl just to go somewhere safe, but instead I had to go to work. The rest of the day, I kept looking over my shoulder, constantly having this weird feeling that someone will come to get me, like someone was watching me. I am so thankful for having 2 doors, because he managed to ever so quietly open that outer door. He could have entered the apartment where I was basically passed out and done anything to me. I reported these 2 incidences to the building's management, and together we filed a police report. They promised to have someone guard the premises for a while until the situation settles down. I am still sleeping at my mother's house and hoping that once I return home, I'll be safe and one day be able to get rid of this paranoia. I will not be keeping my curtains open nor checking out the window at night for a while.